Bound, mocked, and surrounded by armed samurai, he looked like he was finished. But what happened next, none of them would ever forget. In a quiet mountain town in the Pacific Northwest, tucked inside a restored cultural center built for advanced combat training, a group of modern samurai gathered for their annual exhibition. Warriors drilled in discipline, precision, and honor. They wore gleaming golden armor modeled after the old Japanese clans, swords strapped proudly at their sides, their presence radiating authority from a mile away. And then, out of nowhere, everything spun out of control. A man stepped onto the path, barefoot, dust covering his feet, an old faded orange robe hanging off his shoulders like something he'd picked up off the floor. Hands shoved into his pockets, head bowed, walking as if the world itself didn't matter. Locals whispered. Some thought he was just another drifter. Others claimed he'd been hanging around town for days, sleeping in corners, eating scraps. But the samurai saw something else. It wasn't just his ragged look. It was his posture, the stillness, the way his eyes scanned the place with a calm that felt more like defiance. Ryo, the leader, stepped forward. His armor was blood red, glinting under the morning sun. He stood out from the others like a king among soldiers. His smirk was colder than steel. "You're in the wrong place," he said. Not just a warning, but a threat. The man in orange didn't answer, didn't look up, just stood there, still as stone. That was enough. "Tie him up," Ryo ordered. Two samurai grabbed him while the others watched, curious. He didn't resist, not a shove, not a word. He let them bind his wrists as if he had already accepted whatever was coming. On the temple steps, tied down and surrounded by warriors in armor, he looked like a ghost in the wrong century. And yet, he wasn't afraid, not even close. What burned Ryo the most wasn't the man's presence, but his silence. He expected begging, pleading, some sign that the drifter knew his place. Instead, there was nothing, just silence. And for a prideful samurai, that silence was poison. "Maybe he doesn't even speak our language," Hiroshi, the youngest, mocked. "Or maybe he's deaf or dumb." Another chimed in, and the group laughed, but the man heard. And when he finally raised his head, the laughter cut short. His eyes didn't show fear or anger or pride. They held something far more dangerous: patience. "Who are you?" Ryo demanded, one hand resting on the hilt of his katana. The man just tilted his gaze skyward, like the moment wasn't worth answering. Then one samurai moved closer, blade aimed to slice his robe. "Don't," the man said suddenly. His voice was calm, straightforward. Ryo froze, not in fear, but in surprise. That's when they saw the scar on his forearm, a half-moon mark, old but unmistakable. Not from an accident, the kind of scar you only get on a battlefield. "Who are you?" Ryo repeated, but now the arrogance had slipped. The man lowered his head, whispering almost like a prayer. "I'm just someone who learned in silence, but if you really want to know, I am a Shaolin Kung Fu master from a monastery you've never heard of." A heavy hush fell over the temple steps. The jokes died instantly. What had begun as a spectacle now felt like a mistake, and everyone knew it, too late. Still, disbelief hung in the air. To the samurai, he was nothing more than a beggar faking greatness, and that enraged them even more. Ryo turned to his men, muttering, "Let's toy with him before we throw him out." The samurai laughed again, backing away to give space. But the man in orange simply closed his eyes, because he knew. They weren't ready. And worse, they had no clue what they'd just awakened. The sun dipped behind the Oregon mountains, painting the sky in copper and blood. The rebuilt temple stood like a memory pulled out of time, a strange marriage of Japanese tradition rooted deep in American soil. Every curved rooftop, every paper lantern, every black stone path carried stories long forgotten. But this temple wasn't just a training ground. It was Ryo's pride. His grandfather had brought it piece by piece from Japan, rebuilding it high above an abandoned Japanese colony, miles away from civilization. No roads led here easily, no strangers wandered by, which meant no one would see what was about to unfold. Rio was the direct heir of an old clan, sworn to keep the essence of the samurai alive, even in a world that had long forgotten what the word honor truly meant. Raised under brutal discipline, forged in silence, he had become a symbol of control and strength. But behind that polished facade lay something few ever noticed: a quiet obsession. Rio didn't just want to preserve tradition, he wanted to outdo the masters of the past, to prove that modern blood could be purer, sharper, stronger than that of his ancestors. And that's exactly why the stranger in the ragged orange robe got under his skin. While the rest of the warriors slept in silence, Rio stayed awake, watching the prisoner through the temple window. The man sat tied up, legs crossed in lotus, eyes closed, as if meditating, or maybe just sleeping deeply. No request for water, no attempt to escape, no begging, nothing. Rio clenched his fists. Something was wrong. No beggar behaved like this, and no real fighter stayed that silent in the face of humiliation. The next morning during training, even the dojo students sensed something off about their master. He was sharper, colder, harder. "Today, we train focus and destruction," Rio announced, splitting a stone block in two with a single sword strike. But not even the crack of steel cutting stone could shake the thought of the man bound in the courtyard. And he wasn't the only one unsettled. Hiroshi, the youngest of the group, impulsive by nature, couldn't hide his restlessness. That man's presence had rattled him. Later that night, he crept into the inner yard where the prisoner still sat unmoving. "You're lucky to still be breathing," Hiroshi taunted. "Want to know what happens to those who mess with samurai?" The man's eyes opened slowly. He didn't answer. Hiroshi stepped closer, arrogance masking hesitation. "You scared, huh? Or just too dumb to react? Didn't anyone ever teach you to listen before you speak?" The man said calmly, never raising his voice. Hiroshi stumbled back. That cut deeper than any threat. The following morning, as the group stretched in the black stone courtyard, Rio made his move. "Untie him," he ordered. The warriors hesitated. "Let's see if this beggar can stand against me." They formed a circle. The man in orange rose slowly, tension hanging like static in the air. Rio handed him a wooden sword. "Defend yourself, but don't push it too far." The stranger's fingers curled around the weapon with unsettling ease, as if it had lived in his grip thousands of times before. Yet he didn't strike. He didn't move. Rio lunged, testing him with a lateral slash. The man slipped aside, feet gliding with effortless precision. Another strike, another dodge, still no counter. Until suddenly, the tip of the wooden blade tapped Rio's shoulder, gentle as a whisper. He froze. "That's enough for today," the man said, handing the sword back. The silence was suffocating. Rio swallowed hard, eyes locked on the stranger as if, for the first time, he was facing something he couldn't explain. He didn't know it yet, but this was no beggar, and he was definitely not alone. By the third morning, the village itself felt different. The air turned colder, even with the sun high overhead. The forest around the temple had gone eerily still, as if nature itself sensed something was about to break. Inside, the warriors moved through their routines, precise but shaken. Their confidence had cracked. The man in orange remained, calm, silent, watching. He didn't speak. He didn't question. He didn't sleep as much as they thought, and that disturbed them more with each passing hour. Rio, on the outside, stayed composed, but inside, the unease gnawed at him. The touch of the wooden sword still burned on his shoulder. Not the strike. It wasn't even a strike. It was the way it was delivered. Clean, subtle, almost respectful, as if the stranger had chosen not to go further. That stung worse than a defeat. So that morning, Rio summoned the warriors to the tea room, the place where decisions had been made since the temple's founding. "This can't go on," he said firmly, eyes fixed on the wooden wall. "He hasn't threatened us," one elder answered cautiously. "He only reacted when you tested him." "And that's the problem," Rio snapped. "He doesn't threaten, he observes. He's not here by accident, he's waiting." The room went dead silent, smoke without fire. Hiroshi jumped to his feet. "Then let's end it. He's good, yeah, we all saw that. But there are 12 of us. One man can't be stronger than all of us together." Rio didn't respond right away. He slid open the wooden door with his fingertips, staring out at the courtyard. "You don't understand. This isn't about strength anymore. It's about control. He's testing us, just not in the way we expected." Meanwhile, in the central yard, the man in orange watched birds trace patterns across the sky. His gaze stayed calm but alert. He felt the tension thickening. The samurai were done playing, and he knew exactly what would happen when they stopped. Later that day, during live blade training, Rio announced a new exercise. Real combat, pairs. One fights, one observes. Switch after each round. Everyone participates. But this wasn't training. It was theater, a trap disguised as discipline. At the end, Rio had the stranger dragged to the center again, bound. "Let's see if you can teach," he sneered, tossing a wooden sword at his feet. "One by one, my men will fight you. Last 5 minutes without falling and we'll set you free." The man glanced at the weapon, then at Rio. "And if I refuse? Then we dump you in the forest. No food, no honor." Silence stretched. Finally, he picked up the sword. The first challenger was Hiroshi. Fast, reckless, strong. In less than 2 minutes, he was on the ground, weapons stripped from his hands. The second was Jin, more experienced, cautious. 2 moves later, he was off balance, disarmed. Third, fourth. The results were the same. The man in orange never attacked in anger. He only defended, his every move precise, efficient. It looked less like a fight and more like an ancient dance, known only to him. By the 6th match, Rio raised his hand. "Enough!" The warriors stepped back. They were sweating, shaken, some even trembling. Rio walked up to him, eyes burning, though his voice stayed cold. "You're skilled, but you're still an outsider here, an intruder." "I never asked to enter," the man replied quietly. "You brought me here." Rio smirked. "Maybe, but now there's only one way you leave here, either beaten or broken." The man in orange didn't reply. He simply handed back the sword and sat down again, as if nothing had happened. But everyone knew his calm was a blade, invisible and sharp, ready to cut. In the days that followed, the temple shifted. Training grew harsher. Tension between the samurai thickened. Some started questioning Rio's decisions. Others avoided crossing the courtyard where the stranger remained. One night, a warrior finally approached him quietly. "Who are you, really?" he asked. The man looked at him with unsettling tranquility. "Someone who came to remind you of what you've forgotten." "And what's that?" "That strength isn't noise, it's silence in motion." That same night, as paper lanterns swayed in the wind and the distant drums of a purification ritual echoed through the valley, something fractured within the group. Not just fear, division. Hiroshi, impulsive as ever, was the first to say aloud what the others kept swallowing. "We shouldn't keep him locked up," he whispered to Jin as they walked between the temple and their quarters. "He's had plenty of chances to hurt us." "He didn't. You saw it. He's holding back." Jin avoided his gaze, but he felt it too. The nameless man in orange wasn't breaking them with fists. He was dismantling their spirit with control. Absolute control. And in the shadows, another figure watched with quiet interest. Sayuri, daughter of the temple's founder, had returned from Kyoto only days earlier. A scholar of the lost traditions of Bushido, she brought back old scrolls and manuscripts, accounts of forgotten masters, and records of Shaolin monks who once crossed paths with samurai centuries ago. When she heard of the captured stranger, she chose to see him for herself. In the dead of night, while the warriors slept, Sayuri stepped into the courtyard. He was no longer bound, granted the right to move within a guarded perimeter. He noticed her presence, but didn't turn. His voice was soft, almost a whisper. "You don't fight, but you carry yourself like a warrior." Sayuri drew closer. "You don't talk much, but every word you say weighs more than their swords." The man opened his eyes. For the first time, there was a hint of warmth in his gaze. "You've read more than they've trained. That's why you understand." She sat beside him, unafraid. "Who are you?" He hesitated, then said, "Once I was a master. Then I was nothing. Now I'm only what silence has left behind." That was enough for Sayuri to see. He wasn't here for ego. He wasn't chasing glory or revenge. He carried something heavier, maybe trauma, maybe guilt, maybe a promise. By morning, Rio caught his sister watching the prisoner from afar. The tension between them flared. "Don't get involved with him," Rio snapped. "He's manipulating everyone." "No, Rio. He's showing that truth doesn't need words." Rio turned away, jaw tight. Sayuri knew her brother couldn't stand being challenged, especially in front of others, but she no longer cared. She was starting to realize the rot wasn't in the man in orange. It was in the temple itself. It was Sayuri who uncovered the first clue. Digging through the documents she had brought from Japan, she found an old record of a young kung fu master who had vanished after a massacre at a Shaolin temple in southern China. No name, but the description matched the man in orange exactly. The next night, she returned to him. "They killed your students, didn't they?" The man didn't answer. He just closed his eyes, and in that silence, she understood. His temple had been attacked, his disciples slaughtered. He survived and chose exile, chose silence. Whether out of guilt, vengeance, or promise, she couldn't tell. Sayuri rose, shaken. For the first time, she felt her father's temple no longer stood for what it once had. It needed a new purpose, and maybe this man carried the key. But while Sayuri saw wisdom, Rio saw only threat. Behind closed doors, he began plotting the end. "By week's end," he told his men, "he faces all of us. No rules, once and for all." "This isn't training," Jin muttered. "It's an execution." "No, it's the restoration of order." That same night, Sayuri slipped a folded note under a stone in the courtyard. "If you want to escape, there's a path open in the forest behind the temple. You have until sunrise." The next morning, the note was still there, untouched. He wouldn't run, because whatever reason had brought him here, it wasn't finished yet. The final day of the week broke heavy, like a storm pressing down on the mountain air. Everyone felt it. The temple itself seemed to strain under the weight of what was coming. Even the crows, permanent fixtures on the roof beams, had vanished before dawn. Word of the coming fight had spread. It wasn't a challenge anymore. It was a sentence. None of the samurai smiled now. Not even Hiroshi, who once mocked the man's silence, could mask his unease. Everyone knew they were walking into something inevitable, but no one understood why. He had never attacked, never threatened. He simply existed. And somehow, that was unbearable. The man in orange spent the entire night awake, seated on the cold stone, eyes open, as if listening to voices from a world no one else could hear. Sayuri tried once more that morning. "You don't have to fight," she said firmly. "I didn't come here to fight." "Then why not leave?" He looked at her with the same calm he'd carried from the start. "Running is what you do when you want to escape. I'm not escaping. I'm just waiting for the right moment to end something that began long before I came here." Sayuri fell silent. In that instant, she understood something that would haunt her. The man hadn't come to the temple. The temple had summoned him. Through Rio's arrogance, through the cracks in its purpose, it had rotted from within, and he was the answer. When the hour came, the courtyard was marked with a circle of stones. No audience, just the samurai, Sayuri, and him. Rio stood ready, armored again in his gleaming wine-red plates, katana polished sharp through the night. "Today it ends," he whispered, more to himself than to anyone else. The man in orange stepped into the circle, no sword in his hands, only his presence. Rio frowned. "You're going to fight me unarmed? I never needed them. You think you can take all of us down with your bare hands? I didn't come here to defeat you." Rio stepped forward. "Then why are you here?" The answer came like a breath of wind. "To show what happens when you forget why you fight." A hesitation rippled through the courtyard. Silence, broken only by the rustle of leaves in the wind. Rio braced for the first strike, when suddenly the ground beneath the temple shuddered. One of the wooden pillars trembled. Sayuri ran to the main hall and froze. Cracks were spreading through the foundation. This can't be," she whispered. She tore through the archives, pulling out the old blueprints. And there it was, something no one had noticed in decades. The temple had been built over an old seismic fault line, inactive for more than 50 years. An unstable ground, buried and forgotten. But what did that have to do with him? Then she remembered a passage she had read countless times in Shaolin scrolls. "The warrior does not strike first, he observes, and where there is imbalance, he becomes the silent earthquake." Sayuri bolted back into the courtyard. "Rio, stop the fight!" But it was too late. The first blow had been delivered, and with it, everything shifted. Not the fight itself, but the atmosphere. The temple shook. The ground gave under their feet. Birds scattered into the sky. Iron bells hanging from the arches began to tremble on their own. Rio froze. What's happening? The man in orange fixed his gaze on them all, eyes intense, as if he could hear something breaking. Not wood, but the foundation itself. This place can no longer carry the weight of lies. A fissure split the stone floor. Not wide enough to swallow anyone whole, but deep enough to rattle every heart in the courtyard. The temple was collapsing from the inside out. It wasn't sorcery. It wasn't a curse. It was truth made visible. The arrogance, the corruption, the blind pride of Rio and his men had built a temple that was unstable, inside and out. And the man in orange wasn't the cause. He was the mirror. Rio tried to press on with the fight, but his men faltered. They weren't afraid of the enemy anymore. They were afraid of the place, of what it meant. The trembling earth, the groaning beams. Sayuri shouted at her brother for the first time. "Don't you see? He isn't here to destroy, he's here to restore." But Rio was blind with pride. The fight wouldn't happen. Not now. Not like this. The man turned his back, walked to the center of the courtyard, and sat down among the cracks and falling dust, still, waiting, as if to say without words, "Now, you're ready to listen." The temple, once a symbol of order and discipline, now stood on the edge of collapse. Cracks lined the walls. Pillars shook at the slightest breath of wind. But what had crumbled most was something unseen, the samurai's faith in their own path. Since the almost duel with the man in orange, no one trained the same. Movements were hesitant, focus shattered. Their certainty that they controlled the temple, the rules themselves, had evaporated like mist off cold stone. Rio, alone in his quarters, spent nights sharpening his katana. But it wasn't steel he was trying to cut. It was the doubt festering inside him like a cancer. Sayuri, on the other hand, acted. For the first time, she left the quiet archives and walked among the warriors. She spoke to elders, reminding them of the founding values the temple had forgotten. Many listened. Jin, Hiroshi, and 3 others stopped guarding the man altogether. He was free to walk the grounds now, but he didn't. He stayed in the courtyard, meditating as if waiting not for a fight, but for an awakening. One morning, Sayuri approached him with a rolled parchment. "My father wrote this before he died," she said softly. "I've never shown it to anyone." The man nodded, allowing her to open it. In elegant calligraphy, the words read, "When the temple forgets why it was built, it won't be a warrior who comes. It will be a mirror." Sayuri lifted her eyes. "I think you're that mirror." The man only smiled faintly. Meanwhile, Rio shut himself deeper in pride. His wounded ego weighed heavier than any blade. He couldn't stand that a man with no clan, no weapon, no name had turned his own disciples against him without lifting a finger. In private, he confronted Hiroshi. "I saw you bow to him," Rio hissed. "I didn't bow. I respected. You're betraying the clan?" "No, I'm just opening my eyes." Rio's stare darkened. For the first time, he realized he wasn't just losing a fight. He was losing the temple. Outside, the man in orange sat in silence, but he could feel it. Every crack in the walls was an echo of something rebuilding inside each warrior. Sayuri went further. She gathered the remaining samurai and made a bold proposal. "None of us should fight him, not until Rio understands why we're here." "And if he never understands?" Jin asked. "Then maybe this temple needs a new leader." The words echoed through the halls like thunder. Change had already begun. Some disciples trained with Sayuri, others gathered near the man in orange, trying to learn from his posture, his gestures, his silence. As if rediscovering something long forgotten, from the highest balcony, Rio watched it all. "So that's it," he muttered. "He didn't come to destroy. He came to replace me." But he was wrong. The man didn't want to replace anyone. He wanted the temple to wake up. And for that, there was one last obstacle, one last duel, not out of rage, not out of pride, but because sometimes silence has to speak louder than the sword. The temple would never be the same. It wasn't because the temple had been physically damaged, though cracks and scars now ran through its structures. The real change was inside the people. What had once been celebrated as rigid virtue was now being questioned. The mechanical repetition of rituals, strikes, words, all of it was being re-examined with clearer eyes. And it had all begun because of someone who barely spoke, the man in orange. Little by little, his silent presence had become more than unsettling. It had become transformative. Jin, once Rio's right hand, now spent hours each day simply sitting in silence, watching the stranger. A small act, but one that felt like a lesson in itself. Hiroshi began training with his eyes closed, trying to feel the weight of his own body as the man did, an exercise that at first seemed pointless, but slowly gave him a balance he had never known. Sayuri gathered the youngest disciples into circles, reviving the temple's forgotten teachings, writings about humility, wisdom, discernment, values buried under layers of misinterpreted tradition. Meanwhile, Rio withdrew further into isolation. But even in solitude, he had started to listen. Subtle signs, a longer pause over an ancient scroll, a training session cut short by unexpected reflection. For the first time, he wasn't fighting an enemy. He was fighting himself. On the fourth night after the partial collapse, Rio wandered the temple halls alone, barefoot, wearing only the lower half of his uniform. No sword. His footsteps echoed across the worn boards. When he reached the courtyard, the man in orange was there, eyes closed, in the same position, the same stillness. Rio stopped a few steps away. "I built this temple with my own hands, with blood, with discipline," he muttered, his voice tight. "And now, they all look at me as if I were a tyrant." The man didn't open his eyes. "The temple didn't fall because of your strength, Rio. It fell because of the fear you created inside it. I prepared them for the world. No, you sealed them off from it. And when you build walls too thick, you stop feeling." Rio said nothing. Pride weighed heavy in his chest. But the anger was gone. "I trained under masters from Japan, from Vietnam. I lost my father to this legacy, and now I don't even know what to do with it." The man finally opened his eyes. "Then maybe it's time to stop doing and start being." A simple answer, but for Rio, almost unbearable. The next morning, the samurai witnessed something none expected. Ryo kneeling before the temple altar. No armor, no sword, no words. Sayuri watched from afar, eyes brimming. It wasn't weakness. It was surrender, real surrender, to something stronger than himself, awareness. And the change didn't stop with him. Hiroshi, the most impulsive, began meditating quietly before training. Jin corrected younger students with patience instead of shouting. Training itself was restructured. Every technique was followed by a moment of introspection, of purpose. The man in orange, once just a passive presence, was now sought after. Never teaching directly, but becoming the center nonetheless. Not by command, by example. And still, he never spoke his name. One evening, Sayuri found him gazing at the sky. "Why don't you tell them who you are?" she asked. "Because they don't need a name. They need a reminder. And what will you do after this?" He looked up at the stars. "Wait for the next temple that's forgotten why it was built." She smiled sadly. "You'll leave." "Not yet. There's one lesson left. One that can't be taught with words." The next day, Ryo donned his wine-red armor once more. But this time, it wasn't a display of power. It was a closing act. He knew what had to be done, and with whom. The temple had changed. The men had changed. Now the leader had to prove he was worthy of change too. On the seventh morning, the temple was quieter than ever. Not the silence of tension. This was silence of expectation. Something invisible aligned in the air, as if even the wind blew with sharper intent. Everyone knew something was coming, and this time no one tried to run from it. Sayuri moved through the halls, preparing the temple. She had gathered every disciple, veterans and novices alike. No training scheduled, no orders given. What was about to happen wasn't part of routine. It was greater, it was symbolic. Ryo stayed alone until midday. He gathered his wine-red armor, cleaned each piece with his own hands, and put it on slowly, like honoring for the last time a version of himself that was about to die. He walked into the center of the courtyard. There, the man in orange was already waiting. Unarmed, no trace of challenge in his face, only that absolute serenity, more powerful than any blade. All the other samurai sat around them, not as soldiers watching a duel, but as students about to witness something they didn't yet understand. Sayuri was there too, but she didn't intervene. She knew this had to happen. Ryo stopped in front of him. "Today, we don't fight for victory," he said. "We fight for truth." The man nodded. "I didn't come here to destroy you, Ryo. I came so you'd understand what's already been destroyed." Ryo drew his katana. The ring of the blade slicing the air echoed like an ancient bell. "If there's still something in me that needs to fall, bring it down." The man didn't back away. He didn't strike. He simply took his stance. For long minutes, nothing happened. They just stared at one another, time suspended, clouds frozen in place. Then Ryo attacked. A clean strike, powerful, precise. But the man in orange slipped past it effortlessly, like water flowing around stone. Another strike, another evasion. A pivot, a bare arm block. Ryo's katana was caught between his opponent's fingers for the briefest moment, enough to break the rhythm of the assault. Ryo stepped back, breathing hard. And for the first time in years, he felt something new. Not anger, not pride, but deep respect for the lesson being given. And then, without a word, the other samurai rose to their feet. One by one, they walked into the courtyard. "If Ryo falls alone, it's defeat," Jin said. "But if we fall together, it's rebirth." Hiroshi stepped forward first, taking his stance at Ryo's side. Then the others. Together they formed a circle. The man in orange looked at them, not with vanity, but with acceptance. He knew what was coming, and he knew it had to happen. Sayuri held her breath. No one knew how this would end. They only knew that after this moment, nothing would ever be the same. The circle was set. 12 samurai ready for battle, Ryo in the center, his red armor blazing in the last light of day. The man in orange stood unarmed, surrounded, yet there wasn't a flicker of fear in his eyes. Sayuri watched from the temple balcony. Her heart raced, but her gaze was steady. She knew this wasn't a fight for power, it was purification. Ryo took the first step, then Jin, then Hiroshi. "Now you show us who you really are," Ryo said, "or fall nameless." The man lifted his eyes as if hearing echoes of distant masters. Then he walked slowly into the center of the circle, stopped, breathed, and for the first time he spoke, "My name is Li Shen." The silence lasted less than a heartbeat. Ryo roared, "Attack!" Hiroshi came first, fast, determined. Li Shen slipped past him like smoke, spinning and dropping him with a strike to the knee and a push to the shoulder. Disarmed, Hiroshi fell flat, stunned. Two samurai charged from opposite sides. Li Shen dropped low, pivoted, sweeping one off his legs while twisting the other's arm and stripping his sword with an open palm. The circle wavered, just for a second, and that was all he needed. Li Shen moved like water, like wind given human form. Every strike was sharp, controlled without excess. He never hurt more than necessary, but each fall carried a lesson. They weren't just being beaten in body, they were being unmasked in spirit. Every sloppy defense was a reminder. Training strength without purpose is nothing but emptiness. Jin resisted the longest. He fought with two sweeping northern strikes, but Li Shen slipped inside his guard, twisted his wrist, and dropped him with a single controlled push. Only Ryo remained. Breath ragged, sweat dripping, eyes wide. He spun his katana with fury. "I won't fall like the others!" Li Shen said nothing. Ryo charged, screaming, footsteps cracking across the courtyard. He slashed high. Li Shen dodged. He cut low, blocked on a bare forearm. Then with one fluid motion, Li Shen stepped back, seized a fallen katana and hurled it aside, showing he didn't need it. Ryo roared again and swung for the killing strike. Li Shen pivoted, his hand landing at a precise point on the armor. A subtle press just beneath the collarbone. Ryo froze. His eyes widened. The sword dropped. His body buckled to his knees. "How?" he whispered, trembling. Li Shen leaned in, voice low, meant only for him. "You trained to win." "I was trained, never to need the fight." Ryo looked around. All his disciples lay on the ground, not dead, not broken, but defeated, cleanly, undeniably. Li Shen stood tall, turning to Sayuri, who still watched from the balcony. She nodded, not in triumph, but in recognition. In that courtyard, before generations of corrupted tradition, the beggar they had captured had undone them all, not with rage, not with vengeance, but with truth. The courtyard fell silent. Bodies scattered, swords abandoned, heavy breathing everywhere, but no pain, only the weight of awakening, as if each warrior had just emerged from a long, dark sleep. Li Shen stood at the center, calm as a living statue. No celebration, no smile, only breath, steady and patient, as though he had fulfilled an inevitable duty. Sayuri descended the temple steps slowly. No words, only her eyes spoke, respect, understanding, and one unasked question. Li Shen met her gaze with quiet certainty. They didn't lose, Sayuri. They remembered. Ryo still knelt, his red armor heavier than ever. No blood, no cuts, but broken in a way no blade could cause. He lifted his eyes. "What are you, really?" Li Shen looked at him, an instant stretched into eternity. Then he answered without pride, "I am only the reflection of what you forgot you once were." Sayuri looked around. The samurai began to rise, one by one. None of them looked at Li Shen with hatred. On the contrary, there was something in their eyes that had never been there before, humility. Then Ryo, with effort, removed his armor and let it fall to the ground. For the first time since founding the temple, he stood without any symbol on his shoulders. "If you wish to leave, you may go," he said. Li Shen walked toward the temple gates. Before crossing, he stopped, turned back once, and spoke only a single time. "I didn't come here to teach anything. You were simply ready to remember." And then he was gone. The forest paths swallowed him like mist. No one followed. No one asked where he was going. The next day, the temple underwent its greatest transformation. Swords were no longer the priority. Training now included silence, reading, listening, inner balance. The cracked walls were never repaired. They remained, as a reminder of the day everything changed. Sayuri assumed leadership, with everyone's support. Rio became her second, quieter now, observant, aware, and Li Shen was never seen again. But from time to time, a traveler in an orange robe is spotted in distant villages. He carries no weapons. He never says where he's from. Yet wherever he passes, something shifts. Because he doesn't carry the fight, he carries what comes before it, awareness. Months later, the temple had become a beacon of a new era where strength was a consequence, not the goal. Sayuri led with balance. Rio, humbled, taught the novices not with shouts, but with questions. Of the defeated samurai, not one abandoned the temple. They all remained, because here they hadn't been humiliated. They had been rebuilt. Li Shen never returned, but he left what was needed. Not a lesson, but a reminder. And carved into a stone in the central courtyard, it now read, "Here we fell, and because of that, we rose." If this story held you until the end, it's because deep down it spoke of something beyond fighting. It spoke of ego, honor, memory, and transformation. Li Shen didn't win with his fists, he won with purpose. Share this story with someone who needs to remember that not every battle is won with strength. Sometimes, all it takes is a mirror to change everything. And now I ask you, are you fighting or just reacting?